Welcome to my Boxy pouch sew along, which hundreds of you have requested on my social media channel. So here it is. It is super beginner friendly. Although it looks complicated, ultimately it's just a straight stitch. So I will take you through all the steps of how to quilt it, how to put in a zip, which I know a lot of you are nervous of, but you really don't need to be. And hopefully it all makes sense. If you've got any questions, then do leave them in the comments and I will get back to you. I will be doing a pattern so that you can do different sizes, and I will put that on my website coming soon. But for now, I've kept this all free. I've put the sizes for this one in the video as I go along. I've done a full length one that I'm going to post onto YouTube because I know some people find it easier to watch on YouTube and start and stop. But this is it. If you enjoy it and you make some to give as gifts and you'd like to say thank you so that I can keep this free, then feel free to buy me a coffee. The link is in my bio. And I hope you enjoy it and do share your makes with me. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to quilt our outer pieces. You can do it without quilting, but I just think it looks so much nicer. So you need 2 pieces of your outer and 2 pieces of batting, 16 inches by 9 inches. Now for the batting, I use a medium weight, which is about 4 ounces, and I think that works really well. You'll also want 2 pieces of your lining, 12 inches by 7 inches, and a tab that we'll use for the zipper tab. You'll just need one of those, 4.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and then a 14-inch zip. So first you want to take your 2 outer pieces and just place them on top of their pieces of wadding. And to find the centre, just fold it in half where you can measure it and just keep a note. It doesn't need to be an exact science. Keep a note where that middle bit is. Now with your heat erasable pen or maybe some coloured chalk, you just want to mark that centre line, and that's going to be your first quilting line. If you don't have a quilting bar, which I'll show you in a minute, now you would just draw all of the quilting lines on here, and you can do it any distance apart that you like. I like to use a Hera marker, which is this, and it's just a hard edged piece of plastic that you just indent the fabric. So rather than having lots of lines that you need to get rid of afterwards, you use this to mark the centre line. So head to your sewing machine, and top tip, if you don't know what thread to use grey because it works on pretty much every colour of fabric. Make sure you're sewing with a straight stitch, and you just want to increase your stitch length to 3.5. Before we start quilting the lines, along the top long edge, just sew 1 line of stitches, and this will just make it so much easier and stop the material shifting with the wadding. And I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's just to keep the 2 together. And if you've got one, now is the time to get your quilting bar. You may have this in your box of goodies that came with your sewing machine and you don't know what it is. It is a quilting bar and it is genius. On mine, it just simply slides in behind the presser foot, and then you just set the distance that you want the quilting to be. On mine, I'm doing this at about 2 centimetres, kind of an inch distance. So we want to put the fabric in, and we're just going to sew down that first centre line that we made. And for this quilting, there's no need to backstitch at the beginning and the end because all of the ends are going to be cut off when you cut it down to the right size. If you've got a quilting bar, you'd simply then line up that line that you've just stitched underneath your quilting bar, and then put your presser foot down and sew your next line. And now you're looking at the quilting bar, not at your presser foot and needle, and that will ensure that all of your lines are nice and straight and lined up alongside each other. So keep quilting your lines until you reach the left hand side of your square of fabric. When you do, you need to go back to that centre line and go the other way. So that means you need to turn the whole thing round and then line up that centre line that you did originally under the quilting bar and go the other way. Do that till the whole piece is quilted, and then repeat exactly the same on your other piece of outer fabric. Now we need to cut these outer pieces down to 12 inches by 7 inches so that they're the same size as the lining pieces you cut originally. And I take a piece of paper that's 12 inches by 7 inches and fold it in half, and I put that middle fold down the centre line that you've just stitched, and that just makes sure that the lines you've quilted are straight up and down on that panel. When you're happy, you just pin that piece of paper to the fabric and then cut around it, either with your scissors or with your rotary cutter. So you'll end up with 2 outer pieces that are the same size as your 2 lining pieces. Now we're going to make the zipper tab. So take your zipper tab fabric to your ironing board, and you want to fold it wrong sides together in half along the long edge and give that a press. Then unfold it, fold the outside into that centre line and iron that. Do the same on the other side, and when you've done both sides, then fold them in together so you've got no raw edges basically. Give the whole thing a good press, and then we're just going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch down that open side just to make sure it's all nice and closed. Head back to the sewing machine and you want to set your stitch length back to 2.4, which is the average stitch length. And then with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, so you just want to line it up. I follow the line on my presser foot. Sew down the open edge all the way from one end to the other. And again, you don't need to back stitch at the beginning and the end. When you get to the end, just turn it round and do the other side so that you've got 2 nice lines of top stitching. Then get a pair of scissors and you just want to fold that in half and cut it so that you end up with 2 zip tabs, and you can just cut off any loose threads just so they're a bit neater. Now this next bit's optional, but I do like having a tab on the end of my zip as well on the final boxy pouch. So if you want to do this, cut yourself a piece of fabric 4 inches long by 2 inches wide. And you, with the right sides facing, I'm just using a different fabric for this so that you can more clearly see the right side. So with that right side facing you, put the end of the zip that doesn't have the pull on it inside and about halfway along, and fold that tab piece of fabric over. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're just going to sew as close to the end of that plastic zip as we can. So I've switched back over to my striping material for the final boxy bag, and then you can feel when you remove the clip, you can feel where that bobble of that end of that zip is, and then just to the right of it. You don't want to sew over it, but you want to be as close to it as you can. You just do a straight stitch all the way across, and it will look like this. And you can then just fold back those tabs and you've got a really nice tab end on your zip. Back at the cutting board, we're going to just cut down those edges. So line it up and running parallel to the edge of the zip, cut those edges off, and you want the tab itself to be 1 inch long. 1/2 inch is going to be showing and 1/2 inch is going to be in your seam allowance. When you've done both sides in the end, now it's on to the constructing of the whole boxy bag. Take one of your quilted outer pieces of fabric, and with the right side facing you, then get your zip, and starting with the tab end, and you want the zip to be right sides down, so the right side of the zip is against the right side of the fabric. Starting with the tab end, you want to pin or clip that into place along the top right hand edge of your outer piece. Then smoothing that quilted piece down as you go so that the zip is as flush with it as possible. Just continue to pin or clip that in place all the way along. Now don't worry if you've got a bit of the zip hanging off at the end, because that's going to get cut off later, and actually having that zip pull out of the way when you're sewing the zip makes your life a lot easier. Now taking your lining piece, and I apologise for doing this with stripy fabric, which it isn't obvious which is the right and the wrong way, but with the right side facing down, you want to pin and clip that then into place so that you're creating a sandwich of the outer fabric, the zip and the lining fabric. Continue to pin or clip that all the way along, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine and sew it. For this, you want to change out your standard presser foot with your zip foot. If you don't have a zip foot, then you will just need to move your needle as far left as possible, just so that you're getting as close to the zip as you can. And you'll be able to feel the ridge of the zip underneath the fabric, and you want to be sewing just to the right of that. Now my zip foot's quite narrow, so it's quite handy because I can just follow along the right hand edge with the top of the fabric. But if you have the needle, you just don't want the needle to be going into the zip itself. And then we're going to do a little back stitch at the beginning, and we'll do the same at the end to really secure it. And then we're just sewing with a normal 2.4 straight stitch. Keep going till you get to the end, and just before you run off the edge, you just want to do a little back stitch, as I say, just to secure that stitch. And you've sewn in the first half of your zip. Now we're going to open that up and we're going to press that down so that we can do a nice neat top stitch. And with your iron, you don't want to do it too much because you'll flatten the wadding inside, but just enough before heading to the machine. And you want to, we've still got your zip foot on, and we're sewing about 1/8 of an inch away. Just make sure that that lining is away from the zip pull bit so it doesn't get caught in it. And then you just want to back stitch at the beginning, sew all the way down and do another back stitch at the end. And it should look something like this. So now we want to sew on the other side. So taking the second quilted panel, you want to lie that face down so that the right sides are together, then flip the whole thing over so that you've got the lining facing you, and just line up the top of the piece that you've just sewn with the top of the quilted panel, and pin or clip that in place all the way along, and just make sure that the left and the right hand sides of the pouch are lined up nicely. Just double check that your right sides of your lining and right sides of your quilted pieces are facing each other, and then we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew that zip in as well. And you want to do exactly what you did last time, so a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and making sure that you're sewing just to the right of the zip and you're not sewing on the zip. You'll be able to feel the bump of it underneath as you sew along. When you get to the end, just check everything's lined up nicely still before you do a little back stitch just to secure your stitches. When you've done that, open it out like you did before and do a top stitch in exactly the same way as you did on the other side. Now you're going to open up your zip so that you've got it open enough so that you're able to turn it through later on. And just to make it easier when we're sewing the sides together, we're just going to go and do a small tack across there just to make sure that zip pull doesn't come off. So we switch back to your normal presser foot from your zip foot, which you're not going to need anymore. And we're literally just going to sew forward and back and using your hands to keep both sides as tight and as close as possible. And it'll look something like this. It's just a few stitches just to keep them together. Just double check that your zip is open enough for turning through later, and then we're just going to cut the edge of that zip off to the right of the stitches that you've just made. Now it's time to sew on the zip tabs. So you just want to take one of them, fold it in half, right sides together, and then place it over your zip end. And you want the raw edge against the raw edge of the pocket. So the loop that you've just folded is facing into the zip. And pin or clip that in place, and then do exactly the same on the other end. Take it to the sewing machine, and we're just going to tack those two tabs in place, which stops them from moving when we're sewing everything else together. And you're just doing this with about 1/4 inch seam allowance so that the line you're stitching is inside the overall seam allowance. Now you want to fold the two outer pieces right sides together and line up the top edges and then clip or pin those into place. Turn it round and then do the same thing with the lining pieces so they're right sides together, and you're going to pin and clip all the way across, but then you're also going to mark a space about 5 or 6 inches wide where you don't want to sew. We're going to take this to the machine, and with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew those edges that we've pinned together, just leaving that gap, which is where you're going to turn the whole thing through at the end. When you've done the lining edge, you want to flip it round, and we're just going to do the long edge of the quilted pieces as well. Next, you want to put your thumbs inside those quilted pieces and pull them apart so that the zip is now running down the centre of the piece, and then once you're happy, you just want to pin those in place. Do it the same thing at the other end, and the key thing is to make sure that the zip and the seam and everything are lined up before you then pin the rest of the edge. Flip the whole thing over, and we're going to do exactly the same thing with the lining. So putting your hands inside and lining it up so that the seams and the zip are falling nice and neatly on top of each other. It's handy at this stage just to iron or press those seams open, because it just makes it easier when you're sewing it all up later, and it makes for a neater finish as well. Lining the lining fabric up with the outer pieces and making sure that those centre seams are all aligned nicely, then clip the lining to the outer pieces. Do that at both ends, and before we head to the sewing machine, just put your hands through that lining gap and just make absolutely sure that you have left some of the zip open, because once you've sewed up these ends, you're going to find it really hard if you haven't left it open to be able to turn the whole thing inside out at the end. Sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and doing a little back tack at the beginning and the end. Just sew all the way across. When you get to the middle bit, because you've got quite a few layers, just take your time, go through it slowly, trying to maintain your 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way across to the end, and do a little back stitch when you get to the end to secure your stitches. And do the same thing at the other end. Right, we're on to the final leg. Now I've made a template that's 1 1/4 inch by 1 1/4 inch square, and I place that against the sewing line that I've just made, so not against the edge, and I mark that square with a heat erasable pen, and I do the same thing on all 4 corners before cutting those out. Now this bit is hands down the fiddliest bit of the whole project, but once you get used to it, it really isn't that difficult. So just take your time, and what we're going to be doing is sewing these boxy corners. So take your first corner of the quilted bit, and you want to pull the sides apart so that the seam is in the middle, and just look at what I'm doing on the video. It's much easier than trying to explain it. Once you're comfortable that they are pulled out and sitting nice and flat, just pin those in place.
And what you want to do is you then want to turn it round and do the same thing with the lining piece so that it's then pulled apart and it's sitting flush with the piece that you have just clipped. So you just need to maneuver all the rest of the bag out of the way. And when you're happy everything's lined up, then just take the clip out and clip all of the lining and the outers together. And it really is worth taking your time and getting these really well lined up, because it does make the corners, the final corners, just sit really nice and neatly. Once you've done one, you then just literally want to do exactly the same thing on the other 3 corners. And when you've done that, we're just going to go to the sewing machine and sew across each corner with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, doing a back stitch at the beginning and the end just to secure your stitches. And now for my favourite bit of any project is turning it the right side out. So through that hole that you've left in the lining, turn your whole thing through using your fingers, or you can get a chopstick, just poke out those corners so they're nice and square. Close the zip and check that everything's nice and sewn together before we go in and we sew up that hole that's been left in the lining. Turn it inside out so you can see that hole in the lining, and because you ironed it before, you should be able to do this quite easily. You just want to match up those edges so that we're tucking in the raw edges, and we're just going to pin that in place and sew it together. I like to put my stitch length down to 1 because that makes it really tiny and quite hard to see. And I do sew as close to the edge as possible, making sure that both sides are being sewn together. And then I go all the way along and starting and stopping with a back stitch again to secure the stitches. And once you've done that, you have finished your boxy pouch. I hope you enjoyed this sew along. If you did, do share your makes with me. I love to see them, and like and share and follow for more. Thanks.